This is the first in a new series of videos called The History of the Stock Market. In this series, I'm going to be talking about historical events in the context of swings in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. I'm going to be doing this from years 1901 all the way to the present day over the course of several videos. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I got all of these charts from stockcharts.com. I'm not getting paid by this company for any sort of endorsement, but I do think that they have some very valuable resources on that website, free of charge, and I think that it's a great place to check out if you want to learn more about a specific security and its history. Anyhow, let's get started by looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average all the way back in 1901. It started out at 47.56. You can contrast that to more than 8,000 today as of July of 2009. So as you can see, the stock market has compounded and grown many, many times over. Anyhow, we had a little bit of a run-up here for right at the beginning of the century, and then a couple of relatively mellow years. And then all of a sudden, as you can see here, we had this quite a precipitous drop where the stock market lost nearly 50% of its value. This was called the rich man's panic of 1903 to 1904. And the rich man's panic is quite aptly named. It's named this because it really only affected the wealthy classes of the United States. Back then, not that many people owned stocks. It's not like we had IRAs and 401ks where everyone was buying into the stock market. Back then, it was pretty much just wealthy people who owned a lot of securities, and the stock market had gotten too expensive. There was a correction, and that correction caused a loss of wealth. But that loss of wealth was concentrated to the wealthy Americans. So this panic, this crisis, did not really affect the masses in any significant way. And as a result, we had a relatively quick recovery. You can see that the market bounced back up here quite fast, actually, and peaked again just a couple of years later at 75.45. But it was around this time that a far more serious crisis started brewing. This crisis was the Panic of 1907. What happened here was a couple of speculators were trying to corner the United States copper market. They were trying to buy up all of the copper in the United States, or as much as possible, so that they could have a monopoly and then set the price. Unfortunately, they got a whole bunch of banks to lend them money and get involved in this endeavor, and they made the wrong bet. And all of a sudden, they started defaulting on their debts, and the banks had a shortage of money. They didn't have enough cash on hand to meet their obligations. People started getting really scared because they said, wait a second, the banks are effectively insolvent and our deposits are in the banks, so what are we going to do? They started running the banks and pulling their money out rapidly, and this led to a disintegration of the banking system. There are actually a whole bunch of famous pictures, people storming banks, trying to pull their money out rapidly. And this was a far more serious systemic crisis that did affect all different Americans, both the rich and the middle class, and poor Americans as well. This was not just limited to the wealthy. So this crisis actually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve several years later, and the idea was to prevent crises like this from happening in the future. So anyhow, moving right along though, although this was certainly a difficult time for the markets, there was an important invention that happened back in 1908, and this was Henry Ford's Model T car, which helped bring automobiles to Americans everywhere. It made these cars affordable, and as a result, a few years later, we had a rise in automobile sales, and this led to a growth in the general economy, and the stock market grew along with it. The next few years were relatively docile. We didn't have a whole lot going on in the stock market from 1911 to 1915, but it was around this time that World War I began, and we were not involved. The United States was not involved in World War I at the beginning. And the stock market continued to rise rapidly because we didn't have to deal with the costs of a major war. But as the war wore on, the United States leadership realized that this was not a sustainable strategy. The United States needed to get involved because to protect our own interests in the long run. once the United States got involved, the stock market started falling again, and it actually bottomed around 65.95. And this was right between 1917 and 1918. And of course, this was due to the major costs associated with wartime. However, the war eventually ended, and we started recovering once again as an economy. But this time, the recovery was also linked with inflation. Things were getting a lot more expensive, and the stock market started going up, but common goods and services started getting much more expensive as well. And as you can see, towards the end of this decade, we had another run up in the markets, which led to, as you can see here, a peak at 119.62 right at the end of the decade. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about the years 1920 to 1940, the events like the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the beginning of World War II and the whole New Deal program. So thank you very much for watching, and for similar videos in this series and other series, I recommend you check out my website, www.kanjo.com.